So one is to use interest, to use the fuel of our brain. There are tons of activities, clubs, places you can meet people based on interests, even niche interests. And the more we use those interests, the more we find friendships based on things we're interested in, then we're finding people with whom we have like an automatic connection, right? We have a language. We all like bird watching. We all like kayaking. We enjoy the outdoors together. And it creates like a shared language and a shared experience. So instead of doing the things that everybody thinks they should do, right? Really going into what do you want to do? What do you find fun? What do you enjoy? And letting go of, again, one of those myths that, oh, it's too unique or it's too niche. One of the things that has happened and that's wonderful is that the internet has allowed us to broadcast and share and create community around different interests.
Hello, welcome to episode 282 of the Quiet and Strong podcast, especially for introverts. I'm your host, David Hall, and the creator of quietandstrong.com. This is a weekly podcast dedicated to understanding the strengths and needs of introverts along with strategies for success. Introversion is not something to fix, but to be embraced. Normally, we will air each episode on a Monday. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite platform, leave a review or a rating. That would mean a lot to me and help others find the show. Tell a friend about the podcast and help get the word out there that introversion is a beautiful thing. Caroline Maguire is an internationally recognized expert in social emotional learning, ADHD coaching, and relationship development. She is the author of the award-winning book, Why Will No One Play With Me? And her latest book, Friendship Skills for Neurodivergent Adults, and hosts the ADHD Social Playbook podcast. An educator, coach, and sought-after speaker, Caroline developed a comprehensive social emotional learning training methodology that equips parents, clinicians, and educators with practical tools to build self-awareness, emotional regulation, social understanding, and meaningful relationships. As a neurodivergent person with ADHD, dyslexia, and learning disabilities, she brings both professional expertise and lived experience to her work. All right, Caroline, it's so nice to have you on the Quiet and Strong podcast today. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, we're going to get into the great work that you're doing in your latest book. Tell us about yourself and your journey to the work that you're doing now.
Sure. So I am an only child, so I was always sort of an old soul. I grew up in kind of a rural area called Cape Cod, and it's not the place of the movies where have you have the Kennedys and everything. It's a pretty quiet place, and as a kid, I really struggled to read at an early age, even though I was very hyperverbal. And so in my later elementary school years, I discovered that I am dyslexic and I have ADHD. I struggled socially as a kid. I was just not with people who were my people. And I think that I was like, an old soul. I didn't really know how to connect with other kids. And so my journey has been that when I trained to be an ADHD coach in my early 30s, I discovered that most people with ADHD have had a hard time socially. And I very quickly realized that this was an area where people needed help. Friendship was an area where people needed help. And so I did a master's degree and I started becoming the person who helps people make connection and make friends and find their people and their authentic connections, not trying to fit in, but trying to belong and find those skills.
Okay. So tell us a little bit more. You said you were diagnosed with ADHD and dyslexia. What are those things?
So ADHD is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and it's basically where you don't have enough dopamine and norepinephrine, which are two neurotransmitters. And people think that we're hyperactive because we have an overactive brain, but it's actually that we have an under aroused brain. And so we are missing certain chemicals, makes it hard to focus and self regulate. And so a lot of people take medication to compensate for those chemicals that were missing. And then dyslexia, for me, my reading learning disability meant that I just couldn't sight read. I had a really hard time. I had to use phonics and sounding things out. I can remember anything I hear, but I was a really slow reader in my early childhood, especially, and struggled with, I still, if I read aloud, like when I created the audiobook for my latest book, I struggled with like missing words, skipping words, mispronouncing words. And so that's also a neurological based condition.
And how did you learn to work with ADHD and dyslexia?
Well, I was really lucky in that I had this really lovely teacher who understood that the reading techniques that were very popular in the 1980s were not working with me. And so she sort of brought out certain books that were like out of fashion. They had stopped being what they used to teach reading, and she used them with me, and she spent tons and tons of time with me one on one. And then when I was 12, when I was diagnosed, they said to my parents, like, you need to get her some interventions for this. So I saw tutors and I saw different people to help me with some of the fluidity of my reading so that I could read faster. I had by then become a big reader. Like, I loved reading. I just wasn't that fast. And then with the ADHD, I really didn't do anything about it because they had told my parents I was a girl and that I would outgrow it. But when I was 25, I worked for Johnson & Johnson, and they really train their people really well. I have to give them hats off. And I sat in a ballroom and they described ADHD. All these different experts came in, and I was like, oh my God, this is me. And I went upstairs and I called my mom from the hotel and I said, Mom, don't I have that ADHD thing? And she said, yeah. And they said you would overcome it, but like it would go away, but like it hasn't. And so I went and started seeing a psychiatrist who functioned more like a coach. And she started helping me just figure out, how do you manage this? How do you put in place strategies? How do you, have a better sense of time? And I saw her for like 3 or 4 years. And then I trained to be an ADHD coach. And that also really helped me with like compensatory strategies. Like, if you can't always remember things, how do you externalize stuff so that you remember even when your brain doesn't remember something?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, that's the thing, there's things that come to us naturally, and we need to develop strategies. Have you seen strengths that have come from ADHD or dyslexia?
Absolutely. So, one of my strengths is that I was a theater kid and I do a lot of public speaking. And I have no problem with that whatsoever because of the dyslexia. A lot of dyslexics are very, very verbal. And I was always very good on my feet. I was always very good verbally. And so that's a strength that I think I've definitely used to its utmost. So I have no problem getting on a stage. I have no problem speaking to people, giving workshops. That's a real strength of mine that some people, are terrified to do. So I definitely see that there are strengths. I'm a big picture thinker. I can definitely see the big picture and make those kind of plans. And I think that definitely comes from my ADHD as well.
And of course, we've been talking about you personally. What other forms of neurodiversity are there?
So autism is another form of neurodiversity, which is, characterized by some of the same challenges as ADHD, but additionally, there's social challenges. There's a different way of processing information for autistic folks. They process from the bottom up, so the details and then the big picture, which makes them very good at certain things. There's, different definitions of neurodiversity. The one I did for friendship skills for neurodiverse adults, because I had to make some decisions, includes learning disabilities and includes anxiety. And some people will say, well, that's not everything. There's other things too. But I had to sort of create, some boundaries around it. And I didn't want to do anything I'm not trained in or I don't have background in. So I included autistic folks, learning disabilities, anxiety. I definitely think obsessive compulsive disorder, and folks who have struggled with social anxiety, I would put into that category of neurodiversity too. It can be a kind of a broad term that includes other things, but I would keep it to this for the purposes of things that I can help people with.
Okay. Okay. And so we bust myths on this show. A lot of times it's about introversion, but what myths do you want to bust today when it comes to neurodivergency?
I mean, I think one of them actually goes into the introversion extroversion, which is I think that the way you socialize can be unique and individual. And I think for a lot of us who are children of the 80s and 90s, we were taught to socialize as extroverts, even if you're an introvert, as if there was only one way to socialize. And dovetailed with that is the myth that if you didn't learn to make friends, like in kindergarten, and you come to as an adult want to have more friends or want to have a different social life, that it's too late. And I think that's a myth that is not healthy for us because it limits us. Sometimes, we don't realize what we need until we're older. So I work with people all the time in their 40s, 50s, 60s to change their social approach and to figure out who their people are. And that's a bit myth I want to bust. Like it's never over.
Yeah. And so, I've been diving into your latest book and it was fascinating because you're an extrovert and
I am.
you talked about how, still with all the aspects of your personality, you could find socializing difficult
Yeah.
or even sometimes just uninteresting, boring, So tell us about that because, there's too much placed on introversion, extroversion sometimes. There's just, too many stereotypes. Like every extrovert is always just good at socializing and, enjoys all of it. And it was refreshing to see, well, yeah, that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah, definitely. So there's a bunch of factors here. Some of it is I
Yeah.
am an only child, right? So there's always been a part of me that is fine being alone, that needs to revitalize, that grew up with adults, right? So I like one-on-one relationships more sometimes than like a crowd. But I definitely think, those of us who have ADHD, autistic folks, we tend to struggle with certain aspects of socialization. And there is this myth that everyone who's extroverted is good at socialization. But, if you struggle, with making conversation, if you overshare, if struggle with boredom, and it's a very ADHD characteristic because interest is our fuel. Interest is actually how we ignite our brain. And longitudinal studies have shown that people with ADHD, that it's actually a deficit around interest, that when our brain is bored or uninterested, we have a much harder time producing certain things. And that's because our reward pathway doesn't give us as much dopamine as typical people. So if you think of it as like, if a typical person does a task, they get $1 by their reward pathway for doing that, and they're rewarded with that dopamine, we get 50 cents, which means to continue that task, we're searching for dopamine. And so when something is boring, our brain becomes sleepy and it's harder for us to continue those positive social behaviors. And so I have all kinds of hacks around how to make things interesting. But it does mean that certain events that don't interest me or that I find overwhelming sensory wise, I do tend to shy away from. And I talk in the book about how do you make choices, right? Sometimes you have something at work, you don't really love it, but it's good for your career. Like, how do you make those choices and then find the coping strategies to make it happen in a way that works for you?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny too, because a lot of times people do equate introversion and extroversion just with the social aspects. And it's really not that. It's really that you're mostly turned inward or mostly turned outward. and how you process things. And it's good to have this conversation where, there's much more to it. I mean, I talk about introversion, extroversion because I think it's very misunderstood, but there's so many. We also talk about other factors like we are today, so that's very good.
Yeah, and I think there's also this myth that doesn't understand that it's also how do you get energy, right? And like what I talk about the social cup, what fills your social cup. And I think sort of one of the myths, since we like to bust myths, is that everybody's social cup is filled by the same thing. And that's just not true. Some people, I love a one-on-one chat, right? Some people love a big event. Some people love big groups. What fills your social cup is not always the same. And I think that goes back to that introversion, extroversion, and the myth that we all should be socializing in a way that may not fill your social cup. And you may have tried only to find, I don't feel fulfilled at the end of this, versus something else that you do find fulfilling.
Yeah, and like you were saying, like you have to look at it, like what's going on here? What do I want? You said there might be something you need to do that's good career wise, but
Yep.
if it wasn't, you probably wouldn't do it. And you have to find those things that fill your cup and do more of those. We're always going to have to do things that might be draining. Just it's part of life. But if we could find more things that fill our cup, I think that's the ideal.
Yeah, I think it is too. And I think as we mature, it's harder and harder to feel like we have to have a life of duty, So I think, yeah, you have stuff you have to do because it's good for your career or because it's a gift to your friend, right? I talk a lot about how I don't really like to be out late. And one of my really close friends who I end the book talking about had her birthday party last winter and it was freezing cold and it was in downtown Boston and it started at like 8 o'clock at night. And it was with people I didn't know at all. That's not my best social picture, but it was something she really wanted. And she really wanted everyone to join and she really wanted me there. So in that case, you go, right? Because if you don't go, you're really hurting someone. You go to weddings because you don't want to hurt someone. But you don't have to have every minute of your social picture be about this sort of myth of the extrovert, of doing everything that extroverts like to do. And vice versa, extroverts don't have to do everything that introverts like to do. We have to find those things that fulfill us and, create more of a fabric or a tapestry where we have mixed activities and mixed interactions where we're doing different things with different people depending on what fulfills us.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. And that's a good reason why I do this show. It's like we need to get to know ourselves, but we need to get to know the significant others in our lives as well. And sometimes it is finding that balance. Like you'll go to this party for your friend as late and with people you don't necessarily know, but maybe there's something that you like to do that she would do with you that's not filling
100%.
her cup. So yeah, that's awesome. Well, Caroline, how did you decide to become a coach?
I read an article and I was my company that I was with was having constant layoffs. Like I think I survived 9 rounds of layoffs.
Wow.
And I talk about this story in the book where it got to the point where the lights would shut out in my department because there wasn't enough human activities to keep the lights on in the
Oh,
floor that
oh
I was
no.
in.
Oh no.
And I just started thinking about like what else could I do using my strengths where I wasn't under such pressure, and I could travel less and just, maybe shifting careers. And I read an article in the New York Times about ADHD coaching. And I just was like, I'd be really good at that. And I remember I was on a plane at the time and I passed the article to people I knew and they were like, you would be so good at, like, they all read it and said you would be good at this. And so I used to keep the article and I would pass it from briefcase and purse to purse and I carried it around. And I got laid off. I finally, like, was the last person standing. And I called my mom and I said, this has happened. We knew it would happen eventually. And she said, okay, I hope you'll now go do that training to become an ADHD coach because it's really something you want to do. You're carrying this article from purse to purse. It's clearly something you want. And I think you'd be good at it. And like, this is a sign. And my husband came home that day. He was like, we knew this was going to happen eventually. I hope you'll go get trained. And I had already talked to the ADD Coach Academy where I trained. I was like, well, you'll be happy to know I've already talked to them. And so I spent the 15 months working myself out of my corporate job and training. It was like 15 months or 2 years training at the ADD Coach Academy. And so I decided it based on just this visceral thing that like it was really something I'd be good at, and that I really felt like what I had needed my whole life was sort of compensatory strategies, and that it was something that it would be really fun to help other kids and other young people find their way. And so I've never looked back. It's been 21 years now.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And what are some of the benefits of working with the coach?
Coaching is really lovely in that it helps you hold a mirror up to your life in a really non-judgmental way. So, you can use coaching to figure out problems and dilemmas. That's more life coaching. ADHD coaching is more focused on, I have these things that I do. Let me educate the client about ADHD. And then let me also help them figure out and learn skills around things like time management. And I focus solely, I didn't at first, but I focus solely now on helping people make friends. So I get to spend all my time helping people figure out, skills that they need to build. And so we work on conversation, and we work on, how to make those connections that they don't necessarily know how to make. And then I also help them with dilemmas, friendship dilemmas. Why did this person stop calling me? Where do I want to go to college that would be, finding my people? And so I work with people all across the lifespan. And I love that because it's so diverse too. It's so interesting to work with different age groups.
Yeah, I think that leads us right into my next couple questions. You're the author of two books. So let's talk about your first one. Let's see. I got the whole title here. Why Will No One Play With Me? A Play Better Plan to Help Children of All Ages Make Friends and Thrive. So tell us about your first book.
So my first book was meant to help parents help their children build social skills if their child was struggling to make friends. And it was prescriptive. So there was, all these steps that you would follow and working with your child and building these skills. And I wrote it because there was nothing like it in the marketplace. And I kept waiting for someone else to write it because I literally went to graduate school so that I could do the work I do and write this book. But no one ever did. And it was hard to write. So I know why they didn't, because it was like really complicated to explain to parents how they could do this. But I felt really passionately that not everyone can afford to work with someone like me. And there's a lot of parents out there who are very willing to work with their kids. And I felt pretty passionately that they deserved to have the education that they needed in order to help their children learn these kind of skills and learn to make friends and have those skills that you need to navigate the workplace and life.
And then, of course, your second one that's come out recently is tell us, let's see. So, Friendship Skills for Neurodivergent Adults, a guide for the anxious, uniquely wired, and easily distracted.
Yeah. So, as I was touring around promoting Why Will No One Play With Me, I kept hearing from people like, I get that you want us to help our kids, Caroline, but as an adult, I don't know how to make friends. And I had always worked with adults, and I couldn't really figure out how to get a book published with actual diagnostic labels. And in 2019, when Why Will No One Play With Me came out, the publishing world really wouldn't do that. They saw that as a niche book, not a top publishing house book. And then the pandemic kind of changed everything for all of us, I think. And I really saw this groundswell of people talking about loneliness and friendship and not knowing how to make friends. And the publishing world changed, and they kind of, a few books with diagnostic labels in the ADHD world and stuff did really well. And then they started to say, oh, well, maybe we could do this. So it was really a matter of timing. But I got really lucky in that it was a book I really wanted to write and had been sort of working on, what would I have in it? And then because of the pandemic, which was obviously a terrible time for everyone, but really there became in the sort of zeitgeist of our culture, people talking about loneliness and friendship and how it's hard to make friends as an adult. So that's kind of how that came to be. I'd been thinking about it, but I'd originally been told I couldn't do it. And then I think the public has just been really out there saying, like, we just don't know how to do this. And friendship is hard and things are not going, we have a loneliness epidemic in America. So, and worldwide now. So it was really about timing for the second book. And I'm so happy that it's being so well received.
Yeah, that's interesting that it came out of the pandemic. That's where this podcast started because, people were saying things like, "Oh, introverts, they're just loving this." Yeah, I knew a lot of lonely introverts. I
I
was
did too.
I was feeling very isolated myself, just I love my wife and kids so much and I love spending time with them, but they were the only ones I was seeing, and
Right.
I was missing other people in my life, so my work came out of the pandemic as well. But at least this, not totally, but the podcast came out of just to set the story straight.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's so interesting because I remember people saying that. The other thing that they said a lot that drove me bonkers, and I actually wrote articles about this, is like kids are resilient. And that's not what the research shows. What the research shows is that kids are resilient if they have one caring adult who teaches them the skills to be resilient. And most adults don't have those skills. So I'm with you. I was like, what? Why are people saying these things? And people said the introvert thing a lot. And I remember thinking how lonely so many people I knew were, and that I didn't really know anyone who was enjoying it.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, I two of my kids were now being forced into online school and they weren't seeing their friends. One is an introvert, one is an extrovert, and they both just hated it, and
Hated it.
the other thing is, I think with resilience, you and we've been through a lot of things in our lifetimes. We've learned to be resilient, but sometimes kids don't see that, this is going to be okay soon.
Yeah,
We're going to get through this because, as adults, we have passed through lots of things and seen our way to the other side where kids haven't had that experience yet for many things.
absolutely. And it's modeled, right? You have to see that things can get better. And it's just assuming, it's kind of assuming this narrative of grit, and that grit is something that we possessed in past generations, and that it came from all the like really hard things we went through. And I definitely think I'm a pretty resilient person, and I know exactly why I'm resilient. I'm resilient because my grandfather spent every afternoon with me and taught me those skills, and also constantly told me how things would be okay. And I've had a lot of therapy. So I just, it drove me crazy. I was like, you're assuming this very sort of middle class view of things where kids are, being taught these skills. And also maybe part of why people are resilient is their motivation. And if you don't have anything you're motivated by because you're trapped inside, that's going to sort of crush some of that, will to be resilient. You know what I mean? Like, I just felt like it was just it wasn't a great message. I felt like I just felt too many people were struggling.
Yeah, for sure. So why do the neurodivergent sometimes find it hard to build connections?
There's skills that come from our management system in the brain, executive function, that we tend to have weaker executive function. And not every executive function has to be weak. So we might struggle with organization or planning, but be very good at you know, future thinking, right? Like it's not a one size fits all situation, but a lot of the ways that we make friends and keep connection stem from that ability to self-regulate, and filter what we say, to organize ourselves and plan ahead, to read the room and self-monitor how we are. And those are skills that a lot of neurodivergent people really struggle with based on their brain-based reasons for it. And I think also we're harder to teach how to make friends. And so when we were little, and because people didn't know how to teach us, they would tend to just tell us to stop doing something without providing sort of that key information of like, how do you do something else instead? And then just the science and the way things were taught hadn't caught up to the need. And so a lot of what I'm doing is really inventing ways to take science and take other ways that are out there to teach social skills and changing them to meet the needs of our population and to be more neuro affirming and positive.
What are a few strategies to help somebody build friendships, build connection?
So one is to use interest, to use the fuel of our brain. There are tons of activities, clubs, places you can meet people based on interests, even niche interests. And the more we use those interests, the more we find friendships based on things we're interested in, then we're finding people with whom we have like an automatic connection, right? We have a language. We all like bird watching. We all like kayaking. We enjoy the outdoors together. And it creates like a shared language and a shared experience. So instead of doing the things that everybody thinks they should do, right? Really going into what do you want to do? What do you find fun? What do you enjoy? And letting go of, again, one of those myths that, oh, it's too unique or it's too niche. One of the things that has happened and that's wonderful is that the internet has allowed us to broadcast and share and create community around different interests. And so, maybe it wasn't possible 30 years ago to find everybody who likes, photography about birds, but now it is possible. So that's one of my biggest tips, is to find those kind of activities and join them so that you're meeting people who are like you instead of meeting all kinds of people. It's like the right friends versus the like masses of friends.
Yeah, yeah. And that's good advice too for someone that's struggling to understand their introversion, is because a myth I bust about introversion is that we absolutely like people, you know? We just may like different doses, different ways, but we want to connect. We want to find, and a lot of times too, like people say, oh, introverts don't have anything to say, but you get us on a topic that we're interested in and you can't shut us up sometimes, you know? I I say
Absolutely.
I could talk about introversion all day.
No, I think that's absolutely true. And I think that there's this myth that, you have to do things a certain way. And I think that's part of what you're talking about. And what I'm talking about is that we were taught that, but it didn't lead anywhere, right? It didn't work. And so, one of the things I say to people in the first chapter of the book, for cynics, for people who say, I've tried this before, Caroline, and I'm 40, 50, 60, 30, and it hasn't worked out. So, why should I try again? Is, well, you were trying based on no roadmap, not understanding your neurology, not understanding your needs, and basically pushing down your needs. And I would say the same for introverts. Like, if you've tried before and it didn't work out, were you playing by a playbook that kept your introversion in mind, or were you playing by a playbook that was based on all these myths that aren't true?
Yeah, I love that playbook. In fact, tell us about your podcast, because playbook is in the title of your podcast, because that's a lot of what we talk about here too. It's like there's, you know, when I was younger, there wasn't talk about introversion, extroversion, or not a good understanding of what we're talking about with neurodivergency.
Right.
And it was like there was a one size fits all approach, like you've been talking about, and that's not gonna bring you success. It's really being your authentic self and understanding what your strengths are, what your needs are, and ultimately, what do you want and how is your best path to get that? So tell us about your podcast and what kind of topics you talk on the podcast about.
So it's the ADHD Social Playbook. And we talk about topics around ADHD and socialization and the things that affect us, right? So I'm going to do a podcast soon on ruminative OCD. So, a form of OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, where people ruminate a lot. Or I had an expert on about coping strategies and this idea that there's a lot of myths around emotional coping strategies and this idea that, like grit, that we all just, bear through it and suppress your emotions. And this expert, Janine Halloran, has like great tips on like, how can you cope in a situation that maybe isn't built for you? You have to be in so that you don't, become overwhelmed and dysregulated. So I talk about a lot of different topics, whether it's bringing in an expert who can explain something that's affecting our socialization or people who have something that helps us be better and find our people and understand ourselves better. And so, I had someone on a few weeks ago about self-regulation who wrote a new book on self-regulation. Or I have had people come in and talk about their own stories and sort of to bust those myths, like you said. So it's a wide variety of things, but they all rally around like, how can we find our own way forward, and what's the information you need to figure out your own personal social playbook and what you need to find your people and find that connection, but in a way that works for you, not in a way that works for someone else.
Yeah, yeah, that absolutely. Authenticity is key.
It is.
And one more topic I wanted to bring up from your book, you talk a lot about masking, and
Yes.
trying to be something that you're not. What is masking and how does that play into all this?
So masking is the idea of suppressing your neurodivergent traits and pretending they don't exist in order to fit in. So, for instance, instead of fidgeting, I would suppress that. Instead of doing something autistic folks do, which is stimming, which might be repeating words or it might be saying things over and over again, they would stop doing that. They would suppress that. Or even just pretending that you love extroverted things, right? Like, if you pretend that you really want to be at the World Cup in a huge crowd, surrounded by people, out all day, and that's the way you really want to be, and it's really not who you are and what you want to be, that's masking, because it's pretending and wearing a mask in order to fit in. And we all mask from time to time, and we all have moments when we mask. We don't always tell our boss what we think, right? But for a lot of people who are high masking, they're doing it all day, every day. And then it leads to profound mental health effects and burnout and depression, because you really never get to be yourself with anyone. You're really pretending all the time.
Yeah, yeah. And again, like I was saying, it's all about what do you want, but what are your strengths? What do you need because of different
Yes.
reasons? And what's your best path? So I love that. Is there anything else from your book that we didn't talk about that you want to bring up?
I think that, one of the things I try to do is give really clear strategies. And the strategies don't all have to be used. So, one of the things I say at the beginning of the book is take what you want and leave the rest. So, it's not prescriptive, this book. So, if you are like, I don't need to read the chapter on how to make small talk and make conversation, I'm great at that. Great, don't read it. Or if you disagree with a strategy, and I think this is all part of finding your way forward so that you do things your way. There's not one way to do things. I'm offering you a sort of buffet of different options to help you along your way. And if something you don't agree with it, it doesn't work for you, the whole new mindset is toss it out. You don't have to do everything. I make suggestions even about how much you should socialize. And I give you information like proximity helps us socialize, it helps us make friends, being in proximity with people. But if you say, well, Caroline, doing 3 activities a week is like my nightmare. I cannot imagine it. I do not want it. It doesn't fill my social cup. It drains my social battery. Then don't do it, right? I'm not saying it has to be this way. I'm saying, okay, here's the data on how long it takes to make a friend. And like, here's some possible ways that you want to move forward. And then you can make a choice because it's a new day. I think we're trying to get away from you have to do things one way.
Yeah, yeah. That's probably how we could summarize this show is that's what we've talked about is what's your best way, right? As we've talked about neurodivergency, if there's topics that, were new to people today, what's the best way to start exploring those?
I think one of the best ways is that if you want to follow me at author Caroline M on Instagram, I share groups and nonprofits and places to get information because I feel like that's part of my mission in life is just to say, hey, everybody, if you're looking for this, this is where to go. And also, I share tips and strategies and ways that you could, find your people and move forward. So at author Caroline M is sort of where everything flows from my YouTube channel, my Instagram, and then you can find your way to different resources from there.
Awesome. Caroline, this has been such a wonderful conversation. Thanks again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate you. I hope you take the time to explore other episodes and learn from other amazing guests. Remember, if you're interested in getting to know yourself better, there is now a free Type Finder personality assessment on the Quiet and Strong website. This free assessment will give you a brief report, including the 4-letter Myers-Briggs code. I'll add a link in the show notes. And I'd love to connect with you. Reach out at david@quietandstrong.com or check out the quietandstrong.com website, which includes blog posts and links to social media for Quiet and Strong and much more. Send me topics or guests you would like to see on the show. So many great things about being an introvert, and so we need those to be understood. Get to know your introverted strengths and needs and be strong.